So last week we discussed the stories, the two stories. In short, Rabbi Akiva and other rabbis were walking to Rome, and when they saw how Rome was so the noise emerging from the city was hustling and bustling. When they saw the excitement, they began to weep. They said, and Rabbi Akiva started laughing. So they asked Rabbi Akiva, "Why are you crying?" I'm sorry. Rabbi Akiva asked them, "Why are you crying?" So they said, "Why are you laughing?" I'm sorry. They asked Rabbi Akiva, "Why are you laughing?" Rabbi Akiva responded and asked, "Why are you crying?" So they said, "Here you have the people who serve idols, and they're sitting in peace and serenity, and we, by contrast, those who serve God, our temple has been destroyed." You know what? Instead of me repeating the story by heart, I think we should read the stories again. So I'm going to try to open up the screen, find it on the web, and we'll read the stories again because we're basing it on the stories. Let's read the stories again. Give me just one moment, and I will try to do that. Talmud again. We read it last week, but it never hurts to repeat. Marcos. English, last page. I'm going to do both, it's just easier. Okay, we did these stories last time, but again, because we're going to be discussing them, I figured we should read it again inside. Here we go. Here are the stories. Again, the bold is the words of the Talmud. The regular text is just the interpretation. And it once was that Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Akiva were walking along the road in the Roman Empire. And they heard the sound of the multitudes of Rome from Petoli at a distance of 120 mil. So they heard the noise at a great distance. The city was so large that they were able to hear its tumult from a great distance. And the other sages began weeping, and Rabbi Akiva was laughing. They said to him, "For what reason are you laughing?" Rabbi Akiva said to them, "And you, for what reason are you weeping?" They said to him, "These Gentiles who bow to false gods and burn incense to idols dwell securely and tranquilly in this colossal city. And for us, the house of the footstool of our God, the temple, is burnt by fire. And shall we not weep?" Rabbi Akiva said to them, "That is why I am laughing. If for those who violate his will, the wicked, it is so, and they are rewarded for the few good deeds they performed, for those who perform his will, those who perform God's will, all the more so will they be rewarded," and I'm adding in the future. Now we have the second story. The Gemara relates another incident involving those sages. On another occasion, they were ascending to Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple. When they arrived at Mount Scopus and saw the site of the temple, they rent their garments in mourning, in keeping with halachic practice. Because when you can see the Temple Mountain, you're already obligated to tear the garments, just like a mourning if God forbid someone's close relative dies. That is, if you see the Temple Mountain, if you see it occasionally, not if you live in the old city. I think you have to not see it for 30 days. In any case, when they arrived at the Temple Mountain, they saw a fox that emerged from the site of the Holy of Holies. They began weeping. Rabbi Akiva was laughing. They said to him, "For what reason are you laughing?" Rabbi Akiva said to them, "For what reason are you weeping?" They said to him, "This is the place concerning which it is written, and the non-priest who approaches shall die. And now foxes walk in it. And shall we not weep?" In other words, the fox walking on the Temple Mountain represents the utter destruction and of the place, the Holy of Holies, where it says that nobody is allowed to go other than anyone who's not a priest is not allowed to go there. Rabbi Akiva said to them, "That is why I am laughing, as it is written." And here Rabbi Akiva gives a whole long speech, so you have to keep track. In short, the long speech is that there are two prophecies. Now that the bad one occurred, now I know the good one will occur as well. So here we go. As it is written, when God revealed the future to the prophet Isaiah, and I will take to me faithful witnesses to attest, Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Yebrachiah. Now, what is the connection between Uriah and Zechariah? He clarifies the difficulty. Uriah prophesied during the first temple period, and Zechariah prophesied during the second temple period, as he was among those who returned to Zion from Babylonia. So what's the connection between these two prophets that Isaiah puts them together? Uriah and Zechariah. Rather, the verse established that fulfillment of the prophecy of Zechariah is dependent on the fulfillment of the prophecy of Uriah. In the prophecy of Uriah, it is written, therefore, for your sake, Zion shall be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become rubble, and Temple Mount as the high places of a forest. Micah, where foxes are found. There was a rabbinic tradition that this was prophesied by Uriah. In the prophecy of Zechariah, it is written, there shall yet be elderly men and elderly women sitting in the streets of Jerusalem. Zechariah chapter 8. Until the prophecy of Uriah with regard to the destruction of the city was fulfilled, I was afraid that the prophecy of Zechariah would not be fulfilled. As the two prophecies are linked. Now that the prophecy of Uriah was fulfilled, it is evident that the prophecy of Zechariah remains valid. The Gemara adds, the sages sent him employing this formulation, Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us. And that's the conclusion of this tractate of the Talmud. These are the two wonderful, beautiful stories. Last week, we asked the questions. So I'm not going to repeat all of them, but we asked at least 8 questions. And we started inching toward the interpretation. And the explanation of the big dispute here between Rabbi Akiva and the other sages. And what we said last week is that you have to understand who Rabbi Akiva is. And there was the famous story in the Talmud about Rabbi Akiva, and we were going to bring that story into our discussion to help clarify why Rabbi Akiva, what exactly the dispute is between Rabbi Akiva and the sages, why there's different philosophy where Rabbi Akiva is laughing and they're crying. And the other story is that Rabbi Akiva would always say, whatever God does is for the good. And we discussed that story last week. In general, he understands that when you're looking at the present, you have to look at the future and realize that even if something is bad now, it's going to lead to something good. And that's what we know about Rabbi Akiva. And you see that this plays out in the story. They're looking at the destruction of the temple in the present. They're looking at the prosperity of Rome in the present. So they're weeping. That's a natural response. He is saying, what does the present tell me about the future? So in the first story, he says, if those who serve idols prosper, how much more so those who do God's will prosper in the future. And about Jerusalem, he says, if the city was destroyed, was razed to the ground, was plowed, how much more so razed to the ground, right? Razed means plowed. If it was plowed, then how much more so there's going to be the concept of the rebuilding to the fullest extent, which is going to be the elderly men and women sitting in the streets of Jerusalem. That was the story. That was the 2 stories we read last week. That was the question. We asked 8 questions, which we're not going to repeat. Let's repeat 1 or 2 of them, and then we started inching toward interpretation. Okay. So now we're going to start. If any comments or questions, please share. Otherwise, we start making progress about the stories. One of the main questions that we're going to address, and I want to mention it today because the answer begins to address those questions, is, isn't it surprising that Rabbi Akiva asks them, why are you crying? Isn't it obvious? You're on the Temple Mountain. There's no temple. The fox is roaming the Temple Mountain. Isn't it natural to cry? So, in other words, who has to do the defending, right? They ask Rabbi Akiva, why are you laughing? That's a reasonable question. Now, Rabbi Akiva has an answer. Okay, it's a wonderful answer. But the question of why are you laughing is understood. But when Rabbi Akiva turns to them and says, why are you crying? That seems to be a strange question because obviously we're crying. We're crying because the temple was destroyed. We're crying because our enemies are prospering. So why is that? Why does he ask, why are you crying? Isn't that obvious? So that's the first question. That's the first issue we're going to address. But we're going to address it by first thinking about the story in general, and then we'll see what happens. Okay, I assume that everything is understood until somebody stops me. Okay, here we go. So again, I'm reading a little from the essay of the Rebbe. I'm trying to translate a little bit, and here it goes. When Rabbi Akiva says, why are you crying? What he's saying is as follows. You're obviously not crying because of the destruction of the temple. You're obviously not crying because Rome is successful. So if so, why are you crying? Why does he say that? Why does he say you're not crying because the temple was destroyed? Because you already know the temple was destroyed, and yet you were not crying. So why are you crying now? So it's a little bit easier to understand in the second story. If you read the second story, okay, let's look at the second story for a moment. If you read the second story, on another occasion, they were ascending to Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple. When they arrived at Mount Scopus, they rent their garments in mourning. Okay, so they saw the temple is no longer there. They tore their garments. That's what the law says you have to do. But they did not start crying. They already know the temple is destroyed. They already see the destruction of the temple. Nobody's crying. When they come to the Temple Mount and they see a fox emerge, then they start crying. So when Rabbi Akiva says, why are you crying? He says, what happened now? Well, when you were at Mount Scopus and you tore your garments, you didn't cry. You obviously knew the temple was destroyed, you didn't cry. So essentially what Rabbi Akiva is asking is, why are you crying now? What happened now that triggered this reaction of crying? And the same story is with the first story. It's with the first story. The first story is that they're walking to Rome and they hear the tumult, they hear the noise from Rome, and they start crying. Why are they crying? They say, look, the people of Rome are so successful even though they serve idols. 1 second. Of course, the rabbis already knew that Rome is successful. You know what? The Rebbe says that's why they actually traveled to Rome, because they had to achieve something in the halls of government, right? So they are very well aware that Rome is the superpower of the times, and yet they weren't crying. When you hear the noise of Rome, seems like a very small trigger, and yet they start crying. So Rabbi Akiva says, why are you crying now? Why weren't you crying when you had to pack your bags and leave Jerusalem and leave Israel to go to travel to Rome to achieve something in the halls of power? Then you already knew that the halls of power is in Rome. So if what's bothering you is that the Roman people, that the Rome as a symbol, Rome as the enemies of the Jews who destroyed the temple, are living in peace and tranquility, if that's what's bothering you, what happened now? Why are you crying now? You should have been crying earlier when you knew this. So the same question applies to both stories, where obviously they were well aware of the pain and that didn't trigger the crying. When they saw it, but what did they see? They saw something that doesn't seem so even consequential. What's worse, the destruction of a temple or the fox? Destruction of a temple seems much worse. Well, they tore their garments because of the destruction of the temple. They didn't cry. Then they see a fox, they start crying. Look at the first story. They know that Rome is a superpower. That's why they're spending weeks on the road to go to Rome to try to achieve whatever they need to achieve at the time. And that's okay. That doesn't lead them to tears. When they hear the noise, they hear the excitement of the marketplace. Oh, that's when they start crying. So Rabbi Akiva is saying, you're not crying because the temple was destroyed. That you tore your garments for, that you didn't cry. So if so, why are you crying? So now we understand the depth of Rabbi Akiva's question. Rabbi Akiva's question is not that Rabbi Akiva is ignoring the destruction of the temple. Rabbi Akiva says, you knew the temple was destroyed. A few minutes ago, you tore your garments. Why are you crying now? That's essentially the question.
So is that the question about the timing? So you are in control of your reaction and you don't have to mourn more than 7 days and that kind of type of
so
thing?
Much timing. That's a good question. I'm not so sure it's timing. I think the timing is an indicator. Rabbi Akiva is saying, if you, and you're going to see in a minute, they're going to agree with him. They're not really crying about the actual destruction because they already knew about it. There's something additional that triggered them. Because the timing, if they're crying now, they're crying about the fox, not about the destruction. The destruction they knew about a few minutes ago. They're crying about the fox. What's a fox? What is worse, the fact that the temple is destroyed, or the fact that a fox roams the temple? So today's language, today's psychology would say, look, it's just a trigger, right? Okay. In other words, it's triggering the past event. But Rabbi Akiva says you experience the past event. You're standing on Mount Scopus. You see no Temple Mountain. You tore your garments. You participated in the mourning. And yet there's an issue, yet the trigger happens about something small. But that's going to shift. Both are going to agree that what they're really mourning about is the fox, not the temple. not the destruction of the temple. So destruction of the temple, we mourned already the Tisha B'Av, we already tore our garments. But there's something about the fox that in some sense is worse than the actual destruction.
Because
That's what we're getting to.
Consequences.
We'll see. Well, let's see. Okay, let's look back at the first story. Then we'll tighten this idea. The first story, they knew that Rome is superpower. They knew that Rome was destroy the temple. That's not news. What happens here? I'm sorry, let's start with the answer. So again, we understand why Rabbi Akiva's question, why are you crying? So you already knew that Rome was successful. You already knew that. You got triggered by the noise of the marketplace, all the traffic on Fifth Avenue. Okay, so that triggered you. Why are you crying? The fact that Rome was successful, you already knew that. They destroyed the temple. You already knew that. When they come, the second story, the fox. Why are you crying about a fox? Destruction of a temple occurred. You know about it. You saw it. You tore your garments. You mourned. You didn't cry. You see the fox, you cry. What happened? That's Rabbi Akiva's question to them. What is their response? So first I'll tell you their response, and then we'll see it in the story. Their response is, look, the temple has to be destroyed. That we understand. That's God's plan. The Romans have to be very powerful to destroy it. In fact, there's a concept that the verse says, Isaiah says that the Lebanon, which Lebanon is a reference to the temple. Already in the 5 books of Moses, when Moshe says Lebanon, the word Lebanon comes from the word white. Moshe says, I really wanted to go into the land so I could see the Lebanon. What does he want to see? The Lebanon. He wants to go skiing in Lebanon. He wants to see this, the commentators explain, he wants to see the Temple Mountain, which is called Lebanon, referenced by Lebanon, which means white, because the temple whitens the sins of the Jewish people. In any case, there's a verse in Isaiah that says, the Lebanon will fall in the hand of the mighty. And there's a very interesting medrash upon this. The medrash says that the nation that subjugates the Jews is the superpower. Babylonia, Rome. Why? Because if we're conquered by a small power, it's embarrassing. If you're conquered by the superpower, it makes sense. It takes a superpower to take you down. And the Medrash continues and says that if you think about it, where not only the destruction of a temple, wherever most of the Jews were in the world, that nation was a superpower. When it was Spain, and the Medrash doesn't say it, but if you look in the last 500 years, when most of the Jews were in Spain, Spain was a superpower. When most of the Jews were in Russia, Russia was a superpower. Then you have the United States. It's a fascinating concept throughout history that the superpower is the one that subjugates the Jews. In other words, the destruction of a temple has to occur. That we understand. The subjugation of the Jews in the hands of the superpower, in other words, those who subjugate the Jews are powerful, that also has to happen. In fact, it's actually good for the Jews. It's good. It's not embarrassing. It's good. It would be humiliating if a small power would conquer us. So that's not the problem. What's the problem? The problem is destruction is necessary. But why does the destruction have to occur in the worst possible manner? In other words, you could destroy the temple and leave some and leave the foundation, leave something, leave part of the building. Here it's completely destroyed, completely razed. Now the verse says, Sion Sedetecharash. The verse says Zion will be plowed like a field. But the verse doesn't say which part of the Zion, which part of Temple Mountain. Of the entire Temple Mountain is a big area. You had to have the fox specifically walking at the Holy of Holies. In other words, the bad thing has to happen. But why does it have to happen in the worst way possible? That's the question. The question is, we know the destruction is the will of God. We didn't listen to God. The exile is necessary. It's a punishment, or whatever. And any other way you explain it, it's part of the Jewish purpose to spread to the rest of the world, to elevate the sparks. However you explain it, they understood that. But the pain has to happen, the destruction has to happen, granted. But why does it have to happen in the worst possible way? The scenario, if Zion has to be plowed, if a fox has to roam, it has to roam in the holiest place of Zion. That's the trigger. We have to have destruction, but why in the worst way? And the same things with the first story. With the first story, when they said that when they see the noise of Rome, the Rome is a superpower, okay, but the fact that even after the temple, right? You could say after the temple was destroyed, now we don't need them to be a superpower anymore. So some of them might be diminished. No, they were still flourishing just the same even after the destruction, with no diminishment of their power. He says that I understand that they're going to be powerful, but why are they so powerful? Why is their success to the extreme, which highlights the contrast and the embarrassment for us and for the name of God, that God's house is destroyed. And so God's house is destroyed to the extreme, and their success is to the extreme. In other words, why did the bad things have to happen fully in the fullest extent? That is why they're crying. Now you ask a question, why were they triggered when they saw the fox? So the psychological answer is, no, they were mourning because of the destruction, and the fox was just a trigger. But the Rebbe's answer is no. The Rebbe's answer is the destruction. They understood intellectually why the destruction has to happen. They accepted that. They made peace with that, so to speak. What they didn't understand is why the destruction have to be in the most humiliating manner. That the place that's going to be plowed and the place where the fox travels, what would Rome, is the holiest place. In other words, our most holy place was humiliated in that sense. And also with the might of the Romans. The Romans are successful. We know that. That's why we're traveling to Rome, because it's a superpower. But why is it that the city is flourishing to the extreme? Why can't I find parking there? It's so busy. So that is the question. And now we understand that's a deep question. Now we go back. So what's Rabbi Akiva's response? And once we figure out Rabbi Akiva's response, now we can go looking at what are the philosophical differences. And what we're going to do today, we're going to have still a few minutes left. We're not going to finish the talk today. We have one more week at least. But what we're going to do today is we're going to show how the debate between Rabbi Akiva and the sages also has halachic ramification. Fascinating how the same line of logic is not just when to cry, when not to cry, but it's going to affect their halachic ruling. Okay, what does Rabbi Akiva respond? Rabbi Akiva says, look, Rabbi Akiva says, if the destruction happened in the most extreme form, now I know that the rebuilding is going to be in the most extreme way. In other words, in the most powerful way. And that was one of the questions we asked last week. Last week we asked, Rabbi Akiva said, let's look at the Talmud for a second. Let's go back to the Talmud for a second. Last week we asked that Rabbi Akiva says as follows. You remember the whole speech? He says, well, there are two prophets. There's the prophet that prophesies about the destruction and the prophet that prophesies about the redemption. And this is a very strange statement. He says, Rabbi Akiva said, until the prophecy of Uriah with regard to the destruction of the city was fulfilled, I was afraid that the prophecy of Zechariah would not be fulfilled. As the two prophecies are linked. Now that the prophecy of Uriah was fulfilled, it is evident that the prophecy of Zechariah remains valid. That's what Rabbi Akiva says. And last week we asked a very powerful question. We said, what does it mean that Rabbi Akiva said that if the bad prophecy wouldn't be fulfilled, the good prophecy wouldn't be fulfilled? What does that even mean? Because we know that when God says something bad, he could change his mind. But when the prophet says something good, that could never change. That's the rule. That's why when God tells Jonah that he's going to destroy Nineveh, Jonah's like, you're not going to destroy Nineveh. You're wasting my time. You're too kind. You're going to change your mind. Because when God says something bad, it may not happen. But when God says something good, it has to happen. So what does it mean Rabbi Akiva says, before the bad prophecy happened, I didn't know whether the good prophecy is going to happen. That was a very powerful question. One of the most powerful questions that we asked last week. What's the answer? The answer is Rabbi Akiva is not saying, I didn't know that Jerusalem will be rebuilt. What he's saying is, I didn't know that the rebuilding of the Jerusalem will be with the to the same extent in the most extreme manner. Now that the destruction happened in the worst way possible, now I know that the rebuilding will happen in the most powerful way. That's what he's saying. That's the cause of joy. The cause of joy is not that the redemption. I always knew there'd be a redemption. But now I know, because the destruction is so painful and again occurs in the worst possible way, that I know the redemption, the rebuilding will be in the most powerful way. That when you go to the ice cream store in Jerusalem, you're going to have not only one scoop, you can have a choice of 30 scoops. That's just an example. You get what I'm saying? Within rebuilding, you can have so many different levels. And Rabbi Akiva says, now I see. You see that the destruction wasn't the most humiliating way. What do I see? Oh, now the rebuilding is going to be in not just rebuilding, but rebuilding in the extreme, in the sense that in the most powerful and extreme sense, in the positive. That is, now we have a new light on the discussion. When he's saying, why are you crying? He's saying, why are you crying now? Why is this seemingly insignificant detail triggering you? And their answer is, well, we know that destruction has to happen, but why does it have to happen in the most humiliating way? And the most holy place should be defiled by the fox or dishonored by the fox. And Rabbi Akiva says, if the destruction was in the most painful way, then I know the rebuilding will be in the best way possible. And that's why I'm laughing. Okay, if this is clear, we will continue. Oh, I'm not done yet. One more little detail, which is a beautiful, beautiful detail. One of the questions we asked last week is, of all the prophecies of destruction, unfortunately, if you read the books of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and even Isaiah, there are many, many verses that you could quote to describe the destruction. The one that Rabbi Akiva evokes is the verse by Uriah, who says that because of you, Tzion Sadete Charesh, Zion will be plowed like a field. Okay, so it's a devastating verse, but there are many other devastating verses. Why specifically this one? So here, the Rebbe explains why Rabbi Akiva evokes this verse specifically. Because the metaphor of plowing a field is exactly what Rabbi Akiva is trying to say. When you plow the field, what does it look like? It looks like you're destroying the earth. You have perfectly nice earth, there's grass, whatever it is. You come with the plow and you start turning everything upside down, you start breaking up the earth. And on the surface, it looks like an act of destruction. And in some sense, it is an act of destruction. However, the purpose of raising the plowing is that later something else can grow in a much greater fashion. So Rabbi Akiva is saying, when you look at the destruction of a temple, when you look at the fact that Temple Mountain is desolate, when you look at the fact that there's a fox roaming on the Temple Mountain, or on the other story, when you look at the fact that Rome is not only successful, but they're thriving, if you see that, you have to see that as the plowing, as something that ultimately later in the future is going to grow to produce something better for us. So it's actually an act of leading up to something greater in the future. And again, if the plowing, the more successful the plowing is, the more successful that which will grow. And therefore, if the destruction happened in a way that the most extreme sense, then the rebuilding will happen in the most powerful way. So that is the first point. Now we could start going to the question of how does this affect their halachic thinking? And we're going to, or not, I don't know about their halachic thinking. How would you translate this question, this debate between Rabbi Akiva and the sages and the other sages? How would you translate it in other legal scenarios? And we're going to bring a few examples, which is very interesting to contemplate. Okay, here's the halachic question. Assume this is the case. We have a doctor on the line, so you'll tell us what you would say in this scenario. So assume this is the case. You have a Jew who wants to fast on Yom Kippur. I remember when I was I think I was 14 years old. So we would go around and help people put on tefillin on Fridays. And I once went with my friend, who was working at Chabad of Roslyn in Long Island at the time. We went down his to meet his. He had friends that we go visit every Friday. So we went. It was the day before Yom Kippur, Erev Yom Kippur, the day of Yom Kippur Eve, and he went around to help everyone put on tefillin. And he comes to one office, and there's two people, two brothers, and they literally have a fight with their 85-year-old mother, and they're telling her you cannot eat, you cannot fast, because it's not healthy. The doctor said you can't eat. And she is like, I don't care what the doctor says. I never ate on Yom Kippur, and I'm not eating on Yom Kippur. And they were fighting. It was unbelievable to see. Of course, she should have eaten, and I hope she ate, and I hope she survived. I doubt she survived till today, but that's another story. It's been a long time. But the bottom line is, a Jew wants to fast on Yom Kippur. What are you going to do? Okay, here's the problem. The problem is, there's a minor fast, which nobody ever heard of, which is Tzom Gedalia. The fast of Gedalia. It's the day after Rosh Hashanah. Basically, after the destruction of the temple, there was still a community living through the Babylonians. After the destruction of the first temple, there was still a community of Jews living in Israel, and they had a leader called Gedalia. And when he was assassinated, that community fell apart, and all the Jews were dispersed, and there was no longer an established and organized community of Jewish people in the land of Israel until decades later. So that was seen as a blow to the Jewish community in Israel, and the sages instituted a fast. So it's a rabbinic fast, and of the rabbinic fast, it's not the most severe. Okay, fine. Now we have a question. I come to my doctor, and the doctor says, look, you can't fast. So it turns out you're going to have two fasts in a matter of 8 days, right? A matter of eight days. The first fast is the lesser fast, the fast of Gedalia, which is rabbinic in nature. And then you have Yom Kippur, which is the biblical fast, much more important. So you come to the doctor, and I say, look, the doctor says you can't fast twice in 8 days. You're not strong enough. Now what do? Do I say, I'm not going to fast on the first fast, the lesser one, the fast of Gedalia, the day after Rosh Hashanah? Because if I do so, if I fast, then later I'm not going to be able to fast on Yom Kippur. And Yom Kippur is the far more important fast of the two. So if I'm looking at both of them collectively, it's better to skip the first fast and to fast the second one than to skip Yom Kippur because I was too weak because I fasted the one of Gedalia. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is, right now I have an obligation to fast on Gedalia's fast. The fact that that may cause that later in the future, I'm not able to fast on Yom Kippur, that's the future. I don't have to worry about the future. I'm not obligated to think about the future. In other words, I'm not obligated to take the future into consideration to absolve me of an obligation I have right now. So what would I do? So this would depend on the two opinions. The sages are saying, we are crying because we're looking at the present. In other words, they're present focused. Rabbi Akiva says, you can't just think about the present. You have to think about the present in the context of the future. And if you would translate that to halachic thought, Rabbi Akiva would probably say that if today you don't want to fast, if today you're going to fast, and that would stop you from fasting in the future, you're not allowed to fast today because the future fast is more important. So again, you see here how the questions of how do you think about, how does the future affect the present is not just a nice story philosophically to make you feel good, but it's actually an objective real world question. Halacha question, how do I proceed? Do I ignore an obligation now because in the future I'll have that will allow me to keep a more important obligation? Or do you say every moment I have to think about what I need to do now? The fact that later it may result in something else, I don't have to take that into consideration. There's a famous story that happened. I don't know when it happened, a few hundred years ago, but there's a story which illustrates this point. And it's taking the opinion of the rabbis, not the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, but it's just an interesting story nonetheless. So there was a Jew who penned a letter to a rabbi. I think it was the Radvaz, but I may be wrong. A great sage who lived in, I believe, Egypt. in the 16th century, maybe in the 17th century. And he's a great commentator on Maimonides, a very, very, very famous sage, also a Kabbalist. In any case, so he asked the Radvaz, if it was the Radvaz, could have been someone else, I don't know, I'm not good at it, I don't remember exactly. He said, I have a problem, here's my problem. My problem is that I am in prison for whatever reason. You don't need a reason to get into prison in those days. If you're a Jew, you get into prison, it's not, you don't have to work too hard. And he said, look, once a year, I have a vacation day. You can go home once a year. So he nailed the question to the great sage, the greatest sage of the generation, to say, when should I take my vacation day? Should it be Yom Kippur so I can go to shul? Should it be Passover so I can go eat matzah? In prison, you can't eat matzah. It's not like in America where you can eat matzah in prison. You couldn't fulfill any of the rituals. So which day of the year is the most important that I should take my day off on that day, so I can go home and perform that mitzvah? Which is a very interesting question. Because you have to ask yourself, what's the most important mitzvah of the Torah? What's the most important day? What's the most important holiday to celebrate? Fascinating question. So the answer of the sage is actually fascinating, surprising, but fascinating. The rabbi said, when should you take your day off? Tomorrow morning, the next opportunity you have. Why? Tomorrow you have an obligation to put on tefillin. You have to take it tomorrow. You're going to tell me that by taking my day tomorrow, then in 2 days I can't go to my Passover Seder? That's the future. That's God's problem. Your obligation is to think about what are my obligations in the present, and that's what your focus is. So that rabbi ruled really what the sages ruled, which is focus on the present. Right now, the most important mitzvah is the one you can do right now. Tomorrow I can't do this mitzvah because I have to save money to the next mitzvah. That's future. Rabbi Akiva would be much more inclined to think about, don't fast on Yom Kippur don't fast tomorrow if that's going to stop you from fasting on Yom Kippur. So this is just a little bit of expanding the discussion to see that the question of how the future would influence the present, it's not just a question of mood. Should we laugh? Should we cry? There are also real world ramifications in the halachic process of deciding what should I do. And and I'm just going to take a minute or two to bring more examples that actually are closer to our point. But in the meantime, if anyone has any comments, please share. Otherwise, I'm going to bring another few examples that are a little bit different, but nonetheless, a little closer to our example, if you see what I'm saying.
There is a very interesting element of faith from Rabbi Akiva's perspective that is absent from the alternative. In order to consider that the future is more important, to laugh when you see the fox, and you're laughing because of what the future is, to believe in that there will be a future and that future will be as Hashem promised.
Right. So so stick around for the next 5 minutes. I'm going to give the additional interpretation, and you will see that according to the sages, even if they believe in the future, they still are going to cry. So stick around. That's why I said this was just to get us into the discussion. The next scenario is going to be a scenario actually closer to the next dilemma is going to be actually a dilemma closer to the dilemma of Rabbi Akiva and the sages. And the short answer is going to be, Rabbi Akiva says, the sages would say, even if I know you're right, the future is beautiful, but I'm going to cry now because I'd rather this not unfold this way, as you will see in a second, hopefully. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I was also comment on the same direction, because it makes the question even stronger that we don't know the dates, and the date is in a very distant future.
The Akiva doesn't mind. Akiva, what's time? The
joke that doesn't mind to wait however many thousand years.
1,000 years, yes. What's 2,000 years? Yeah. The joke is the guy comes to God and he tells the God, it says in the Torah that it says in the Psalms that 1,000 years to God is like 1 day. Ki 1,000 years to you is like yesterday. That's what King David writes in the book of Psalms. He says, God, if that's the case, then to you, $1 billion is like $10. So God, what do you care? Give me $10. So God says, no problem, just wait 5 minutes. So that's the joke. Akiva's like, I'll wait 5 minutes. Who cares? 1,000 years, 2,000 years, doesn't really matter. And like Andy says, he's a man of faith. He believes it. He believes it's going to happen. It's going to unfold. Fine. Okay, let's get a little bit more into the details. So to make Andy happy, no, I'm just kidding. What the Rebbe wants to make Andy happy and just heighten this dilemma. Okay. If you could do a mitzvah in a beautiful way in the future, but to do that, you're going to have to pay a price and miss something in the present, right? It's not just wait and do something later. If by doing it in the most beautiful way in the future, I'm actually missing something in the present. For example, when it comes to a circumcision, for example, circumcision is a very big mitzvah. The first mitzvah of Abraham, circumcision, very big mitzvah. Okay, fine. Think about circumcision. There are two mitzvot, there's two concepts. In general, the mitzvah is that you're supposed to do the mitzvah with alacrity. You're supposed to do it in the earliest possible opportunity. You read in the story of the binding of Isaac that God tells Abraham, take his son and bind him on the altar. Avram woke up in the morning. He woke up early, right? So Rashi says this teaches us that if you're doing a mitzvah, you do it with speed, with alacrity. You don't postpone it. No, that's the beautiful way to do a mitzvah. Don't say, oh, first I'll go swimming, I'll go to the gym, I'll go eat lunch. Later I have time, I'll go put on tefillin. No, you have a mitzvah, you do it right away. However, there's another issue. The other issue is that it says in general there are certain mitzvot, berov am, with a great with many people, when there's a big nation is more beautiful for the king. In other words, if the king shows the town and 2.5 people come to visit him, it's embarrassing. If the king comes up to the town and there's a lot of people, that glorifies the king. And that's why certain mitzvot you're supposed to do with a big crowd. The Talmud, for example, uses the example of reading the Megillah. You could read the Megillah by yourself in your house. You don't even need a minyan to read the Megillah, the Purim scroll, right? But nevertheless, the Talmud says you should go to you should go to the synagogue and read the Megillah where there's a big crowd. Why? Because the verse says that when there's a big crowd, it's more beautiful for the king. Okay, now I have my dilemma. If I do my bris for my son in the morning at 6:30 in the morning, the first opportunity, which is the best, which is an important concept, to do the mitzvah early, then nobody can come. I can't get a lot of people because everyone's going to work. If I postpone my bris, it's at the summer. If I postpone my bris till 7 p.m., it's the end of the day. So I have fewer people, so I have many more people come, and this is the beautiful way of doing the mitzvah. The verse says, when you have a big crowd, you're beautifying the mitzvah. But because I'm beautifying the mitzvah, I'm missing an ingredient of doing it early. In other words, I have a much better icing on the cake, but I'm missing an ingredient within the cake. If you ask my kids, no problem. They don't care if you're missing an ingredient within the cake, as long as there's a lot of icing. That's the dilemma. Now, how does it affect to us? The rabbis tell Rabbi Akiva, listen, Rabbi Akiva, yes, in the future it's going to be beautiful, but the price we're paying is that the humiliation, the embarrassment, the chilul Hashem, the embarrassment to God's name that's occurring now, that not only the temple is destroyed, but the temple is destroyed in the worst form possible. That's a greater desecration of God's name. So we'd rather that the desecration now should not be that severe, even if we don't get the cherry on the top, even if the redemption won't be in the most beautiful form. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, I'd rather postpone the bris and have a big crowd later. I'd rather have a beautiful name for God in the future. I'd rather everyone see in the future how the redemption comes in the most beautiful way, which will be the sanctification of God's name, even if now I have to sacrifice something. And in other words, the desecration of God's name now is more severe. So in other words, it's not just a question of present versus future. It's a question of sacrificing in the present. If we had a choice, the rabbis say, if we had a choice, I'd rather that the destruction should not be so bad and the rebuilding won't be so great. Why? Because at least now the destruction is so bad, it's a terrible desecration of God's name. So I'd rather the desecration not be so great and their compensation won't be so great. Rabbi Akiva says, no. Rabbi Akiva says we're future forward, future thinking, not just because in the sense that we say that, oh, I'm future focused, but I'm willing to pay a price in the present. I'm willing to be missing something in the present, doing something quote unquote wrong in the present. I'm postponing the bris. I'm not doing the mitzvah in the earliest convenient time, the most convenient time. I'm willing to accept the fact that the desecration to God's name now will be in the extreme. Why? Because future, and the future that will be compensated for by the beauty that happens in the future. That's both for the bris, where the fact that there are many people coming to the bris in the afternoon overrides the lack of doing the bris in the morning, and the beauty that will come to God's name in the future, that the rebuilding of Jerusalem will be to the most extreme sense, in the most extreme way, or compensates for what's missing now. So if you put them both in the same room, Rabbi Akiva and the sages, and they each know what the other one says, they would still disagree. The sages would still cry, Rabbi Akiva would still laugh, not because the sages don't believe in what Rabbi Akiva believes. They all have all the facts, they all believe in everything. The question is, it's a question of judgment of what is, considering everything on the table, what would you rather have? The sages say, I'd rather the destruction not be so great and the redemption won't be so great. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, I'd rather the destruction be terrible, because that's plowing. And plowing, the more you plow and the more painful the plow is, the more is what's going to grow in the future. And again, the ramification is about the bris. I'd rather postpone the bris in the morning to beautify the bris by having a big crowd in the afternoon. So that now it's a little bit more, you see, this is, we have to do it, the Rebbe does it in stages. The first thing he says, what I said, in other words, just to get us thinking about present versus future, which is the fast of Gedalia versus Yom Kippur. Once we're already thinking in those terms, now we could tailor it even more and think about a scenario where considering the present, the future would actually make you diminish the present, in the sense that I'm actually missing something in order to beautify. With the other fast, it's also that way, but it's not that you don't have the issue of the beautify. Here it's clear that the addition that will come in the future is to beautify the mitzvah. It's the icing. So Rabbi Akiva is so extreme. He says, I'd rather be missing an ingredient now to get icing on the cake later. Because he understands the power of the future and the power of that the future should be in the most beautiful way possible. And the main point is, and that brings him joy now. Because when he looks at the destruction, he doesn't see destruction. He sees destruction as part of the process of leading to the rebuilding. So for example, if you want to think about the plowing of the field, a similar example would be a construction site. When they walk down Millbank Avenue, it was a mess. They just knocked down 5 houses. I don't know which town allowed them to do that. Must have been the town. It wasn't the town of Greenwich, no, but it was. So here you walk by here, and it looks like it's a disaster. Who wants to live here? And it's such a mess, and there's traffic, and there's trucks, and there's noise. So you could look at it and say, what a mess. Or you could see, this is not a mess. This is beautiful. This is a new, not that the building is nice, but you see what I'm saying? This is not, demolition is not demolition. Demolition is construction. That's what Rabbi Akiva is arguing. Rabbi Akiva is saying, the bigger mess you have in the demolition process, that means the more they're digging. That means that the foundations are going to be deeper. That means the building will be able to grow taller. The metaphor is pretty poetic, right? It's not an act of demolition, it's an act of construction. So that's the story in short. Rabbi Akiva teaches us to go future forward. But so far it's balanced. But you will see next week, when we do it next week, or if not next week, the week after, we'll see that at the end, they say, Rabbi Akiva, you comforted us. Akiva, you comforted us. Akiva, you comforted us. Rabbi Akiva convinces them, but that happens not after the first story, but after the second story. So we have to now come back next time and analyze, so the more detailed, what's the difference in the first story and the second story, and how come these people, the sages, are won over by Rabbi Akiva's argument after the second story, not after the first story. So now we have a work cut out for us. But it's fascinating how you have a simple piece of Talmud. Everybody reads it. It sounds so beautiful. It sounds so simple. We're already spending 2 weeks on it, 2 hours. You have 8 questions. You have layers of meaning. And even that's, I'm not reading everything. We're trying to do it fast. But the amount of layers and depth within every story that seems to be simple is fascinating, at least in my opinion. So thank you very much. I enjoyed it. So thank you for giving me the pleasure of studying together with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Yes.
Have a good day.
Have a wonderful day and stay cool and hydrated, because it looks like that in Hebron, it's a very blue sky. Must be hot here. If it's hot here, it must be hot there too. Actually,
It's
they're on the,
always sunny in Hebron.
yeah, they're on the mountains. It's not too bad. At least at night. In the evening. Okay.
Take care.
Wonderful day, everybody. Be well.